Welcome to Danger, the channel where we dive into the world's most chilling true crime stories. Please like, subscribe and hit the notification bell so you can get notified every time we post something. On today's case, we're looking at one of the most shocking and complicated true crime stories to come out of South Carolina, the case of Alex Murdaugh. For generations, the Murdaugh name had been associated with wealth, influence and the legal system in the low country of South Carolina. Alex Murdaugh was a prominent personal injury attorney and came from a family that had built an enormous presence in the local legal community. For decades, the Murdaugh family appeared to represent power and success. But behind that image was a complicated story involving financial deception, addiction, lawsuits, unexplained deaths, a boat crash, and ultimately the murders of Alex's wife, Maggie, and the 22-year-old son, Paul. What makes the case even more remarkable is that Alex was convicted of those murders in 2023, only for that conviction to be overturned by the South Carolina Supreme Court in 2026. As of August 2026, Alex is therefore awaiting a new murder trial, while continuing to serve lengthy prison sentences for financial crimes to which he pleaded guilty. To understand the Murdaugh case, it is important to understand the family itself. The Murdaughs had been a powerful legal family in Hampton County and the surrounding Low Country region for generations. Their law firm, Peters, Murdaugh, Parker, Eltsroth and Detrick, became closely associated with the family, and Alex eventually became one of its prominent attorneys. The family's influence extended beyond their legal practice. Their name was familiar throughout the area, and the professional connections gave them a level of status that ordinary families simply did not have. This background became extremely important later because prosecutors argued that Alex had spent years building an image of success while secretly experiencing serious financial problems. Alex married Margaret Kennedy, known as Maggie, and the couple had two sons, Buster and Paul. The family lived what appeared from the outside to be a comfortable and privileged life. They owned property, spent time at their hunting estate known as Moselle, and were part of a socially connected community. Photographs from the years before the murders show a family that appeared close and successful. Paul was particularly well known among friends and local residents, while Buster was studying and pursuing a career of his own. Alex was working as an attorney and appeared to have everything that came with being a member of one of South Carolina's most established families. However, a series of tragedies began surrounding the family years before Maggie and Paul's deaths. One of the cases that attracted enormous attention was the 2019 boat crash involving Paul. In February 2019, Paul was allegedly operating a boat carrying several young people when it crashed into a bridge near Archers Creek. 19-year-old Mallory Beach was thrown from the boat and died. Paul was charged in connection with the crash, and the resulting wrongful death litigation became a major issue in the Murdaugh family's life. A settlement was eventually reached years later. The boat crash also became important to prosecutors because it demonstrated that the Murdaugh family's financial and legal problems were already becoming increasingly complicated before the murders. Another case that attracted attention was the death of Stephen Smith, a 19-year-old whose body was found on a rural road in 2015. His death was initially treated as a possible hit and run, but questions surrounding the circumstances continued for years. Because of the Murdaugh family's prominence in the area and references to members of the family during the investigation, Smith's death became part of the broader Murdaugh story and received renewed attention after the murders. However, it is important not to turn allegations or speculation into established facts. Smith's death remains a separate case, and the circumstances surrounding it should be presented carefully and accurately. The biggest turning point came on June 7, 2021. That evening, Alex Murdaugh contacted authorities and reported that he had discovered his wife and son dead at the family's Moselle property. Maggie was 52 years old and Paul was 22. Investigators arrived at the property and began examining the scene. The deaths immediately attracted enormous attention because this was not an ordinary family. The victims belonged to the Murdaugh family, and Alex was himself a well-known local attorney. At first, the investigation did not immediately result in Alex being charged with killing his wife and son. Instead, Investigators began examining the circumstances surrounding the deaths, looking at the family, the property, possible motives and the events leading up to that night. Alex publicly presented himself as a grieving husband and father. At this stage, investigators had not established publicly who had killed Maggie and Paul. But the investigation began to reveal something else. Alex Murdaugh was experiencing serious financial problems. Investigators discovered that money had been missing from his law firm and from clients. The financial investigation eventually became enormous, and prosecutors later argued that Alex had been stealing money for years to support his lifestyle and cover financial obligations. Then came another extraordinary event. On September 4, 2021, only a few months after Maggie and Paul were murdered, Alex was shot on the side of a road in South Carolina. He survived. Initially, the incident appeared to be another violent attack against him. But investigators eventually discovered that the shooting was connected to a plan Alex had created to have himself killed so that his surviving son, Buster, could receive a life insurance payout. Alex later admitted that the incident had been staged as part of a suicide-for-hire scheme. This revelation dramatically changed the public's perception of him. It suggested that the financial situation behind the scenes was much more serious than people had initially understood. By the autumn of 2021, Alex was facing criminal charges connected to financial crimes. Investigators alleged that he had stolen millions of dollars from clients and others who had trusted him. The allegations involved complicated financial schemes, including money being diverted from settlement funds and other accounts. The federal government later said that Murdaugh had participated in multiple schemes to obtain money and property from his clients and law firm. The financial investigation continued to grow. In 2022, prosecutors charged Alex with the murders of Maggie and Paul. He pleaded not guilty and maintained that he had not killed them. The state, however, developed a case that depended heavily on the timeline of the evening and evidence found at Moselle. One of the most important pieces of evidence eventually became a video recorded on Paul's phone at the family's kennels. Investigators discovered that Alex had been recorded at the property shortly before the murders. For prosecutors, this was extremely significant because Alex had previously denied being at the kennels with Maggie and Paul shortly before the deaths. The video placed him there. Prosecutors argued that this proved Alex had lied about his whereabouts and that the lie was central to understanding what happened that night. The state also presented evidence about Alex's financial situation. Prosecutors argued that his financial problems provided a possible motive. Their theory was that Alex was under increasing pressure because his financial crimes were beginning to come to light and that he feared the consequences of his financial collapse. According to the prosecution's theory, killing Maggie and Paul could create sympathy, distract attention from his financial problems and potentially buy him more time. The defense strongly rejected that theory. Alex's attorneys argued that the state did not have direct evidence proving that Alex had killed his wife and son. They challenged the prosecution's interpretation of the evidence and argued that investigators had focused too heavily on Alex. Throughout the trial, Alex maintained his innocence regarding the murders. The murder trial began in January 2023 in Colleton County, South Carolina. It became one of the most heavily followed trials in the United States. Reporters and cameras gathered outside the courthouse, and people around the world followed the proceedings. The trial lasted approximately 6 weeks. One of the most significant moments came when Alex himself took the witness stand. During his testimony, he admitted that he had lied to investigators about being at the kennels. He said he had been afraid and distrustful of investigators after the murders and had lied about his whereabouts. But he continued to deny killing Maggie and Paul. The prosecution also questioned Alex about his financial crimes. Prosecutors presented evidence that showed the extent of the financial deception and attempted to connect those crimes to a possible motive for the murders. The defense argued that evidence of financial crimes could unfairly influence the jury by making Alex appear like a bad person rather than proving that he was a murderer. After weeks of testimony, arguments and evidence, the jury reached its decision on March 2, 2023. Alex Murdaugh was found guilty of murdering Maggie and Paul and guilty of 2 weapons-related charges. The following day, he was sentenced to 2 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. At the time, the verdict appeared to bring the murder case to an end. But the legal story did not end there. Alex continued fighting his murder convictions through the appeals process. His attorneys argued, among other things, that misconduct by Colleton County Clerk of Court Becky Hill had compromised the fairness of the trial. The defense alleged that Hill had improperly influenced jurors. A lower court initially rejected the request for a new trial. However, the case eventually reached the South Carolina Supreme Court. On May 13, 2026, the South Carolina Supreme Court made a major decision. The court overturned Alex Murdaugh's murder convictions and ordered a new trial. The decision did not declare Alex innocent of the murders. Instead, the court found that jury interference had compromised the integrity of the original trial and that Murdaugh was entitled to a new trial. The court later formally remanded the case for further proceedings. This distinction is extremely important when telling the story on YouTube. It would be inaccurate to say that Alex was proven innocent in 2026. He was not. His 2023 murder convictions were overturned because the Supreme Court found serious problems with the way the original trial was conducted. The murder allegations therefore remain unresolved in the legal sense, and prosecutors intend to try him again. Meanwhile, Alex's financial crime case is completely different. In September 2023, Alex pleaded guilty in federal court to 22 financial crimes, including conspiracy to commit wire and bank fraud, wire fraud and money laundering. The U.S. Department of Justice said that he admitted to 3 schemes involving money and property taken from personal injury clients. The federal government later sentenced him to 40 years in prison for those federal financial crimes. The Department of Justice described the schemes as involving money taken from clients, the law firm and other sources. One scheme involved settlement checks from Murdaugh's law firm trust account and the involvement of former banker Russell Lafitte. Alex also pleaded guilty to state financial crimes and received an additional sentence. According to South Carolina Public Radio's timeline, he received a 27-year state sentence in November 2023. This means that even after his murder convictions were overturned in 2026, Alex did not simply walk out of prison. He remains incarcerated because of the financial crimes to which he pleaded guilty. The new murder trial is now scheduled for April 5, 2027. In August 2026, Judge Deborah McCaslin ruled that the retrial would not take place in Colleton County because of concerns about whether Alex could receive a fair and impartial trial there. The judge has yet to finalize the exact new location. Another important issue heading toward the retrial is forensic evidence. Murdaugh's defense has sought additional testing of DNA evidence associated with Maggie's fingernails. The defense says testing could potentially identify another person, while prosecutors continue to argue their case against Murdaugh. The question of what evidence will be allowed in the new trial remains part of the ongoing pretrial proceedings. The state also wants to use portions of Alex's testimony from his first murder trial. Whether and how that testimony can be used in the retrial is one of the legal questions being addressed before the new trial. The Murdaugh story is therefore much more complicated than simply saying, a wealthy lawyer murdered his family. There are several separate legal stories happening at the same time. Maggie and Paul were murdered in 2021. Alex was charged and later convicted of those murders in 2023. That conviction was overturned in 2026 because of problems involving jury interference, and a retrial is scheduled for 2027. Separately, Alex admitted to extensive financial crimes and was sentenced to decades in prison for those offenses. He remains incarcerated while the murder case moves toward another trial. What makes the case so compelling is the dramatic collapse of a family that had appeared to possess enormous power and stability. The Murdaugh name had been associated with South Carolina's legal community for generations, yet Alex eventually admitted to stealing from people who trusted him. The investigation into those financial crimes became intertwined with the investigation into the murders of his wife and son. His own lies about his whereabouts on the night of the murders became a major part of the prosecution's case, while his testimony and the evidence presented at trial became the subject of intense public debate. For viewers, perhaps the biggest unanswered question now is not simply whether Alex Murdaugh will be convicted again. It is what will happen when the evidence is presented to a completely new jury. Will prosecutors be able to secure another conviction? Will the defense's arguments about alternative explanations and forensic evidence gain more traction? Will Alex testify again, and will the jury reach the same conclusion as the first jury did in 2023? Those questions will not be answered until the new proceedings unfold. As of August 2026, Alex Murdaugh remains in prison for his financial crimes, while the charges that he murdered Maggie and Paul are headed toward a new trial scheduled for April 2027. His 2023 murder convictions should therefore be described as overturned, rather than as current convictions. The Alex Murdaugh case began as a story about a powerful South Carolina family, but it eventually became a story about deception, financial crimes, family tragedy, criminal investigations and the limits of the justice system. And even after one conviction, a sentence, an appeal and a Supreme Court decision, the murder case is still not legally finished. The next major chapter is the retrial, where prosecutors and the defense will once again present their arguments over what happened to Maggie and Paul on June 7, 2021. Thank you for watching. If you want more factual and respectful true crime content, please like, subscribe, and share. And as always, stay safe.